Section 7 of Women of the War by Barbara McLaren. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by T.R. Love. 14. Commandant Damer Dawson, Mrs. Carden, and the Women Police and Patrols. The employment of women for police service, in vogue for some years on the continent and in the United States of America, has been developed in this country only by the outbreak of war. Women in uniform are so frequent nowadays that the passer-by scarcely spares a glance for a hard bowler kind of hat, plain blue clothes, and a blue armlet with white letters on it. The wearers of this uniform seem to be peculiarly inobtrusive people, anxious to avoid rather than to attract attention. For all that, among the innumerable women who are taking on the new work which the times have entailed, the women police are by no means the least valuable, brave, and steadfast. The names of 3 pioneers are impressed on the memory of those who have watched the development of this movement in Great Britain: Commandant Damer Dawson, Superintendent M.S. Allen, and Inspector Goldingham. It is largely through their tireless efforts that the Women Police Service, the association that they originated, has now at its command one of the finest bodies of women in the country. The influx of the Belgian refugees in August 1914 became the starting point of the movement. While aiding forlorn exiles lost in London byways in the small hours of the night, it was borne in upon Miss Damer Dawson how much work in the street could be done by an organized band of trained women armed with authority. The idea took root in her mind and grew with her work. She was soon joined by Miss M.S. Allen and Miss Goldingham, and from that period the Women Police Service may be said to have originated. These pioneers obtained the necessary training and soon set to work in the organization of a voluntary corps. Recruits flocked in, undertook necessary training in drill, practical, and theoretical instruction, and soon obtained positions as officially appointed policewomen. In this capacity they undertake such work as patrolling the streets, attendance at police courts, domiciliary visiting, the supervision of music halls, cinemas, and public dancing halls, and the inspection of common lodging houses. The need for their services grew steadily. In the summer of 1916 it was found necessary to obtain further control and supervision of the women employees in munition factories, and Sir Edward Henry, the Chief Commissioner of Police, recommended that the Ministry of Munitions should apply to the Women Police Service for a supply of trained women. This request has now created an extensive development, and a new department of the Women Police Service is at present working at high pressure under the Ministry of Munitions. Recruits are streaming in and are receiving a special training, on completion of which they are drafted to the munition factories. There they undertake multifarious duties, including checking the entry of women into the factory, examining passports, searching for such contraband as matches, cigarettes, and alcohol, dealing with the complaints of petty offenses, assisting the magistrate at the police court, and patrolling the neighborhood of the factory with a view to the protection of the women employees. In the case of misunderstandings amongst the women employees, the services of the women police have been remarkable, and there are many recorded instances where they have averted strikes in the munition factories, and thus saved the nation from ill effects on output. In many such ways the women police have proved themselves a valuable national asset. When the war is over, Commandant Damer Dawson and her colleagues will doubtless find that the service they helped to introduce as an emergency measure has become a recognized institution of a new social order. A further service, that of women's patrols for the protection of girls in the streets, has originated with the problems connected with the war. Reports from various quarters having reached the National Union of Women Workers as to the dangers caused by the presence of numbers of young girls in the neighborhood of military camps, it was resolved to organize a body of women of mature age and experience to aid the police in maintaining order. Here again the names of 3 outstanding women are associated with this work: Mrs. Carden, the honorary secretary to the movement; Mrs. Creighton, widow of the late Bishop of London; and Lady Codrington, chairman of the London Committee of Women's Patrols. To these pioneers the work owes its initiation and development. A scheme was formulated, welcomed at once by the Home Secretary and the Chief Commissioner of Police, and by November 1914 the women's patrols were in working order. Branches were quickly established throughout the United Kingdom and Ireland, and there are now over 2,000 women working in this connection in different parts of the country. In its initial stages the work was entirely voluntary, but since its efficiency has been established and noted by the authorities, women's patrols have been appointed in various districts and paid at the same rate as men constables. The main duty of the patrols is to enter into kindly relationship with girls loitering in vicinities where soldiers congregate. Their mission is not to the vicious or to the fallen, but to the thoughtless girls led astray mainly through their excitement at the unaccustomed presence of so many soldiers, and by patriotic emotions of admiration and gratitude to the nation's young defenders. The women on patrol aimed at getting into touch with such girls and helping them to a healthy employment of their leisure hours. In numerous cases the patrol committee have organized clubs in the neighborhood of the military quarters, these meeting places being either for girls alone or mixed clubs where the soldiers may bring their girlfriends. In the latter case, most careful vigilance and supervision from the patrols are required and given, and success is in most instances attained. This work has been warmly welcomed by the military authorities and the police, and it is impossible to estimate the unhappiness and suffering that have been prevented by this provision of healthy recreation in a moral danger zone. Reports both from the metropolitan area, where over 400 patrols are now working, and from provincial towns give some measure of the success of the movement. It is significant that during the Irish disturbances of 1916, the women's patrols were enabled to pursue their customary tasks, being passed through both by the Revolutionary Party and by the soldiers. 15. Miss Lena Ashwell, OBE. Miss Lena Ashwell's work in starting and arranging concerts at the front has possibly given more delight to a greater number of people than the efforts of any other individual woman in the war. The entire scheme was her own, and it is through her untiring efforts and her personal energy that the work has been carried on and extended in a way that is little short of marvelous. It was in February 1915 that Miss Ashwell was asked by the Ladies' Auxiliary Committee of the YMCA to send a concert party to France, and with the goodwill and cooperation of that committee, the work was launched on its successful course. The first party was an experiment in every way, but its reception left no doubt as to the feelings of the soldier audiences. The love of music is enhanced by the alternating monotony and danger of life at the front, and is as fundamental in human beings as the craving for beauty. This instinct is seen, for instance, in the soldiers' touching desire to make gardens wherever they are quartered, and however unpromising the conditions. From Miss Ashwell's tentative effort there has grown up a great organization in response to the ever-increasing request from every base, from every camp, from every hospital, and even from the firing lines for more and more concerts. In little more than 2 years, over 5,000 concerts have been given in France alone, apart from what has been done in Malta, in Egypt, and in the ships of the Adriatic fleet. The audiences have been known to number as many as 5,000 men, and thus hundreds of thousands are reached every month and millions during the year. What are called permanent concert parties have been established at 5 of the bases in France. Each party stays for about 6 weeks, giving on an average 3 concerts a day. In the afternoons, they usually perform in the hospitals. In the evenings, they motor sometimes 25 or 30 miles to outlying camps and stations, performing in tents, huts, barns, sheds, railway sidings, or even by the roadside, to all sorts and conditions of men in all branches of the army. The request for the concert parties to go up to the trenches and firing lines soon followed, and this fresh branch of work was undertaken. Only men are allowed to go in the firing line parties, and the YMCA cars convey them on these tours. Concerts have frequently been given under shell fire, sometimes to an audience fully armed and liable to be ordered into the trenches at any moment. Some of the most successful concerts are those for men just leaving the trenches after days of fighting, and here, perhaps, the music has had its most wonderful effect. It seems to act like magic on the exhausted men, strained almost beyond endurance by the ordeals they have had to face. The spell of horror is broken, and their minds are turned away from all they have suffered to thoughts of beauty and happiness. The existence of the firing line concert parties is in itself a proof of how much the military authorities appreciate the concerts and their effects. They have been quick to realize that the British Army can stand anything better than being bored. The keenness with which the concerts are anticipated, the touching patience of the men who will wait for hours in bitter wind and rain, they would rather miss their principal meal than miss a performance. The discussion for weeks afterwards all prove how much the music means to them. At the outset, Miss Ashwell determined that the concerts should be up to a high standard. The programs are varied as much as possible. Classical music, selections from operas, glees, trios, and concertos, the old ballads and folk songs are all given, as well as popular ragtimes and modern chorus songs. A concert party generally consists of a soprano, contralto, bass, tenor, violinist or cellist, pianist, and accompanist, and often a ventriloquist, conjurer, or reciter. The entertainment given is a mixture of a ballad concert, a recital, and a children's party, writes a member of one audience. Sometimes plays are arranged, and in the autumn of 1916, Miss Ashwell herself took out a small dramatic company and acted in Macbeth, The School for Scandal, and some short modern plays. Writing of these performances, Miss Ashwell says, "We gave The School for Scandal in a wood, with half our audience on the grass, the other half dangerously overcrowding the branches of the nearest trees. Macbeth was given in a great hangar, with army blankets for the walls of the banqueting hall and a sugar box for the throne. Macbeth was an enormous success. Its reception was wonderful. We gave it to vast audiences. They listened breathlessly in absolute silence, and then cheered and cheered and cheered. There were never such audiences in the world before, so keen, so appreciative, so grateful." Nothing can be more touching than the appreciation of the concerts in hospital. There again the spell of the music seems to relax the strain on men's nerves, and the badly wounded and even dying soldiers beg to hear it and find comfort in the midst of their suffering. The following is an extract from a letter written by a nurse. "The concert party gave a concert in the orderly room here, and afterwards those kind people came into each ward and sang softly with no accompaniment to the men who were well enough to listen. And the little Canadian storyteller told stories to each man in turn as he was having his dressings done. The result was that instead of being a suffering mass of humanity, the men were happy and amused through the whole of the time that is usually so awful. Concerts are also given for the medical service and nurses, for whom these occasional evenings are the only relaxation in a life of strict discipline and unending work. In January 1916, in response to urgent requests, arrangements were made to extend the work to Malta, and in October 1916 to Egypt, and as in France, the success has been wonderful. Lord Methuen, the governor of Malta, wrote to Miss Ashwell recently, "I cannot tell you the value that your concert parties have been to Malta. They have kept the men in hospital cheerful, and I am sure that a great deal of the excellent discipline that has been maintained here is owing to the interest the men have taken in attending your performances." From Egypt comes another appreciation from General Dobell, who writes, "The Lena Ashwell concert party has given concerts at all posts where it was in any way possible to allow them to go, and the fact that the ordinary rules were waived and special permission granted them to travel where no civilian in any circumstances had previously been allowed to go will make it clear to you how high a value we attach to their entertainments." A touching account was recently given of an incident at a concert in the Sinai Desert. Some soldiers in a camp 10 miles away, unable to obtain leave, were so much disappointed that they induced the Royal Engineers to lay some telephone wires, by which means these men in the distant camp were able to listen to the concert. Innumerable letters and testimonies to the success of her work have reached Miss Ashwell from all ranks and all branches of the army. Generals, commanding officers, doctors, chaplains of all denominations unite in saying that the concert parties are accomplishing work of real military value. Countless have been the letters of appreciation from the soldiers themselves. In spite of its rapid and enormous increase, Miss Ashwell has continued to organize the work in a personal and vital way. Not only has she frequently been abroad giving performances herself, but she has personally engaged all the artistes for the parties and has supervised their complicated traveling arrangements. Moreover, she has raised the entire funds to maintain the scheme by addressing meetings and making known the work, which has thus been carried on entirely by voluntary contributions. Miss Ashwell has her thanks in the delight of thousands who have been cheered and helped by the efforts of the organization, which she has truly made her own. The great message that the music has brought to the soldiers is well expressed by a medical officer who wrote to her recently. "You do help us by heartening the men up and sending them back to the firing line happy and with the feeling that those at home do care, are with them, and are trying to help." 16. Miss Violetta Thurston. Miss Violetta Thurston has had a career as varied and adventurous as any nurse during the war, and she has certainly used to full advantage the great opportunities which have come to her. Trained at the London Hospital, Miss Thurston was fully qualified to take up responsible work when the war broke out, and in August 1914 she was sent to Brussels in charge of a contingent of nurses from the St. John Ambulance Association. Arriving just before the capture of the city, she witnessed the historical entry into Brussels of the German army. Some days later, when the German authorities asked for volunteers to nurse at a little town called Marceline, near Charleroi, Miss Thurston offered to go, and took 2 nurses with her, leaving the remainder of her contingent in Brussels hospitals. At Marceline, Miss Thurston was in charge of a hospital under the German military command, where she nursed Belgian, French, and German wounded for some weeks under very trying conditions, aggravated by the brutality of the German system of discipline, even as regards her own wounded. After a period of work, Miss Thurston was granted leave of absence from the Marceline Hospital in order to look after the nurses she had left in and near Brussels. She had some exciting adventures, particularly when trying to find a nurse in an outlying village, where she actually got into the German lines and became involved in an outpost action. By this time the Germans had decided that no English nurses were to be allowed to continue nursing in Belgium, so instead of returning, as she had expected, to the hospital at Marceline, Miss Thurston was obliged to spend some weeks of painful and anxious suspense waiting in Brussels, not knowing what fate was in store for her nurses and herself. Finally, together with about 100 other nurses from different contingents and some medical men, she was taken by train through Germany to the Danish frontier. During the journey, the nurses were subjected to constant insult and humiliation. At Copenhagen, however, these unpleasant experiences were made up for by a cordial reception. Miss Thurston was about to return to England when she heard of the great need for trained nurses in Russia, and after obtaining permission from England to offer her services to the Russian Red Cross, she traveled from Copenhagen to Petrograd. Miss Thurston started work at once. After nursing for a time in base hospitals and learning some Russian, she joined a flying ambulance column of motor cars, which moved from place to place at the front. One of the base hospitals in which she was quartered was at Warsaw, where, in spite of the great difference between Russian and English hospital methods, Miss Thurston managed to adapt herself to the conditions. She was then sent on to Lodz, where she had many adventures in the bombardment. Some idea of the work may be gathered from the fact that in the Russian retreat from Lodz, over 18,000 wounded were evacuated in 4 days, during which time the nurses worked practically without rest under terrible conditions. Miss Thurston's life with the workers of the motor ambulance unit was remarkable. They were always on the move and only just behind the front trenches, using any available building as a hospital. At one place they worked in a theater attached to a hunting box belonging to the ex-Tsar, and of the work there Miss Thurston wrote, "The scenery had never been taken down after the last dramatic performance, and wounded men lay everywhere between the wings and drop scenes. The auditorium was packed so closely that you could hardly get between the men as they lay on the floor." At another dressing station, established near the trenches, 750 patients passed through the hands of the small unit in little over 24 hours. Miss Thurston was shortly afterwards wounded when attending to soldiers in the trenches, and as pleurisy developed later, she had to give up work for a time and come home to England. Before leaving Russia, she was awarded the Medal of St. George for courage and devotion. In 1915, Miss Thurston returned to Russia on work of a different character, to assist in organizing the hospital units which were being sent from England to work among the refugees. For 3 months she traveled all through the country, inspecting the arrangements which had been made in Petrograd, Moscow, Kiev, Kazan, Nizhny, and the remote districts to cope with the bewildering influx of over 5 million dazed and terrified people who fled from their homes before the great German advance into Russia. As a result of Miss Thurston's inquiries and the information which she was able to obtain, several units with doctors, nurses, and supplies were sent out to Russia and have done fine work for the refugees. Help for these unfortunate victims of war was badly needed, for their numbers were so overwhelming and their condition so appalling that, in spite of the noble effort made by the Russian authorities to cope with an immense problem, Many difficulties connected with the welfare of the refugees continued to arise. Writing of them, Miss Thurston said, "Verily, the English language lacks words to express the suffering that these people underwent, and nothing that we can imagine could be worse than the reality." On returning to England, Miss Thurston was engaged for a time in organizing and secretarial work for the National Union of Trained Nurses. She was then asked to accept the post of matron at Hôpital des Lucien at Le Pen in Belgium, where she is still on duty. This hospital has over 1,000 beds occupied by patients of Belgian, French, English, German, and even Russian nationality. It is established 5 miles from the front, so the work is far more acute than is usual in a base hospital, the severest cases being dealt with straight from the trenches. Miss Thurston presides over a staff of Belgian and English sisters and VADs under Belgian doctors. Such, then, has been Miss Thurston's war service, as fine a record of achievement in the cause of suffering humanity as any woman can show. Not the least wonderful fact about her is that Miss Thurston is very frail, and has always been delicate. Only her spirit and pluck have carried her through and enabled her to do the hardest work under the roughest conditions. Writing of her, a friend says, "There is no doubt that Violetta Thurston is a woman with a touch of genius, and with, as well, a great devotion to work, not an everyday combination. She has determination and courage in an unusual degree, and is gifted with imagination and a deep sense of beauty. Nevertheless, she can drudge." Miss Thurston was recently decorated by the King in recognition of her devoted services. End of section 7.